Interim Committee on Finance and Revenue is open. The Senate committee then is in session, and we're joined by some House member guests today.
Hi.
We do have an
It's nice
agenda
to see you.
here. We're going to scramble it a little bit and go straight into the forecast, and then afterwards the Senate will do a couple items of business that we have. So let's pull in Mark and Josh and begin. Little reminder, if you're watching on the internet or on the computer, refresh your screens now so that the new information that's about to be presented will be updated.
The actual thing you're interested in is
Thank you, Chair Haas, members of the committee. My name is Mark McMullen, Oregon State economist, joined as always by my colleague Josh Lehner to give you the quarterly economic and revenue update. So this time, the economic update, we're going to go through it pretty quickly. For one, really the story hasn't changed very much, and secondly, I don't want to bury the lead. We have some pretty exciting revenue news to get to later on in the discussion. So usually with the economic outlook, I form the talk and start with recent performance, and then do the outlook, and then talk about risks. Well, most of that really hasn't changed much. The recent performance still pretty hunky-dory. The outlook is very stable, and so we're going to spend a lot of our time talking about risks. While the near term is still looks solid, data flow is good, we're starting to hear some narratives about what could happen a couple of years down the line, and so we discussed some of those potential pathways for weakening going forward. But for now, things are pretty solid, although we have been in this expansion for quite some time. The first chart I put up before this group looks at the length in years of economic expansion since World War II. And as you see there at the end, the current one, if we can make it to the end of this, our budget period that we're in right now, the 1921 biennium, will be the longest expansion on record. So we get the question where we go about the state. So does that mean we're due for a recession? Is our time up? Well, not necessarily. As it says in the chart, expansions don't die of old age, and the economic literature would argue that the probability of going into a recession over the next year or two is independent of how long you've been in a recovery. That said, we know we can't go forever. But we have gone quite a long time in the past. Between the 1991 and 2009, 1982 and 2001 recessions, Oregon didn't really have a severe budget crisis. 1991 was a recession, but a relatively mild one here, as we had some inflows from California to offset some of the weakness. And as a result, we didn't really see our state revenues decline. We saw them flatten for a couple of years, but we didn't really have the same kind of shock that we've had in other business cycles. And so that period, from the most severe recession we had in 1982 until the tech recession, which was also severe, about 20 years of relatively stable budget situation. So it's not out of the question. And right now, national forecasters are pretty sanguine about the outlook. Wall Street Journal surveys professional forecasters, and right now they're at a 15% risk of recession over the next year. If you look at the average of forecasters, which is pretty small, relative to history. I was at an economic forum event put on by Tim Dewey at the University of Oregon just a week ago, and he was arguing that over the next year he sees a 0% chance of a recession in Oregon. Now, zero, that's a little bit, I wouldn't go that far. You never want to tease the forecasting gods like that, because, as soon as you put that down on paper, that's when everything falls apart. Of course, Tim's an academic, so he never has to put it on paper. So he can go ahead and stick his neck out a little bit more than maybe we can. So at any rate, that people aren't seeing a whole lot. And why is that? Well, because here we are in a mature expansion. There's some real healthy demand and indicators out there on the private sector side, and we're also at the same time pumping a lot of federal fiscal stimulus, not just in terms of the tax plan, which is a deficit widening plan, which would suggest at least near-term stimulus, at the very least a sugar high, but also the spending plan, which is even a bigger chunk in terms of we know that spending tends to turn directly into economic activity, at least in the near term. So everything's looking pretty good right now, but there's starting to be a lot of discussion out there about what could go wrong and you know how this long expansion cycle could finally end. And I think the most common story has to do with traditional monetary policy mistakes. As I discussed before, we're an economy that's operating near its capacity, and we're pumping a bunch of fiscal stimulus in it. So what might that do? Well, the danger is that it may overheat the economy somewhat and create, in particular, upward pressure on prices. And we are starting to see, although inflation is still in check for the most part, it has been accelerating over time. And so the response to that, an increase in prices, is Federal Reserve tightening policy, raising interest rates and trying to cool off the economy, try to engineer what they call a soft landing, which in theory is a great thing to do. In practice, it's a very difficult thing to do. And we have very little room in terms of the interest rate environment to pull this off. And so the concern is that, as has happened often before, if the Fed starts to tighten monetary policy too quickly, take the steam out of the economy and turn it into this negative perpetuating cycle, which is a recession. The other risks up there, I'll have Josh talk a little bit about the potential for trade war, although that's cooled off a little bit. We have started to dig into what that may look like. I mean, right now, all we have between China and the Trump administration is sort of a slap fight going on without any real action. But nevertheless, that China's a lot bigger than it's ever been before. And in the past, the U.S. has always been really the impetus of a global demand slowdown because the U.S. economy is so dominant. But not so much anymore. And so we start to worry about, well, maybe the next recession will come from a demand shock abroad, in particular maybe China that has some debt issues. Oil prices is also a traditional conduit for a recession. We saw that in the 70s and in 1991. And recently we've seen a real run-up in oil prices that was unexpected and may put a damper on demand and go a long way toward offsetting some of that fiscal stimulus. And finally, later we'll talk about housing affordability in a broader discussion. Housing affordability is more of our local risk rather than the others or these global macroeconomic risks we're talking about. But we're going to have a section where we cover some of the things that Senator Boquist and Representative Marsh were asking us to talk about before, that is migration trends and homelessness, and that's where we'll fit in the housing affordability discussion. So with that, I'll pass off to Josh to chat a little bit about the trade numbers.
Thanks, Mark. Chair Haas, members of the committee, for the record, Josh Lehner, economist, Office of Economic Analysis. And as Mark was saying, right, so far we've seen a lot of various proposals bandied about when it comes to trade relations, both with our closest neighbors here in NAFTA, trying to rejigger that agreement to potentially to some degree, and then also a proposed set of tariffs, a couple rounds of proposed tariffs between the U.S. and China. And so what we've started to do is dig into these numbers, taking the line-by-line items on the individual products, whether it's, swine meat or golf carts coming back the other way or whatever the case may be, and just try and get some idea of how large of a direct economic impact we're talking about. Because Oregon is typically somewhere 11th, 12th most trade-dependent state, depending upon the study or the rankings. We're above average in terms of our exposure to trade, and we're certainly above average when it comes to exposure to China in particular. The share of exports that are going to China, when measured against the relative size of our economy, is among the largest in the nation. It's right up there with any other state. However, the proposed list of tariffs to date exclude a lot of those exports, in particular our high-tech manufacturing products, our semiconductors and the things like that, which are manufactured here in Oregon and then shipped to assembly plants around the world. Those are not on the list to date. So when we look at the specific things that are talked about in recent months, maybe our direct trade exposure with China on the tariff list is relatively muted, and it's in line with maybe something along with the typical state. We're talking $400 or $500 million of products, and that maybe is an upper bound as well due to data limitations. Half of that number comes from auto exports and soybean exports. And obviously, Oregon is not an auto manufacturing hub, nor do we grow or export all that many soybeans here in Oregon. But we do know those products come from elsewhere in the nation, flow through the transportation network, arrive in the port of Portland, and then go out to the rest of the world. So to the extent that we just have some data classification issues that are miscoding that data back to Oregon instead of all the way back to the auto plant in the Midwest or the soybean growers in the Midwest or in the South or what have you, it may overstate Oregon's direct impact. That said, should these things decline and should the tariffs be put in place and reduce the Chinese demand for American products, we would still feel an impact here associated with those transportation jobs and the longshoremen operations and all that sort of stuff that go into the flow of goods and services around the world. That said, we also have some direct impacts, whether it comes from our farmers and our grains and our fruits and our nuts and our aluminum exports, the scrap aluminum that we do, and some of these other things are on the list as well. So there will certainly be an economic impact in Oregon directly and then also indirectly via our exporting facilities at our ports and what have you. But you put all this together, and what does it tell you? It tells you that the story in our mind hasn't really changed in the last 6 months relative to where it was a year ago. It's not about these bilateral trade negotiations that will really drive the needle in any sheer sense of a macroeconomic impact. It's really about the integrated global supply chain. So to the extent that we muck up these international relations, it'll bog down the entire system, and then we'll have slower economic growth, slower imports that go into the manufacturing process and things like that. So
Josh?
again,
Representative Smith, did you have a question on this?
I actually do. Thank you. I'm hearing your dialogue on tariffs, but one of the major issues I'm hearing from manufacturers in the Willamette Valley and in Eastern Oregon is container availability, and that is a significant prohibitor of growth in the state of Oregon. And with Tacoma and Seattle becoming the container ports for the state of Oregon, containers are not coming down into Oregon, and it's stifling growth. As folks will understand, a container that may originate in Seattle 2 weeks from now may be in Hong Kong, 2 weeks from then may be in Australia. So containers are not location, always in the same location. Are you hearing any of that? Union Pacific saying it, the ports up there are saying it, the ocean-going carriers are saying that those states who have deep sea ports will continue to grow strongly, while those without it are going to suffer in terms of not being able to get those containers and therefore not be able to get their exports out.
Chair Hass, Representative Smith, absolutely. I think the ongoing long-term trend towards larger and larger ships will continue to benefit the deep water ports, and they'll continue to grow and get larger and larger share of the volume. Being an inland port, with the Port of Portland being 100 miles upstream, and you have to go across the Columbia Bar and all that sort of stuff, there's a lot of logistical hurdles to container service in the region, and that has knock-on effects, particularly when it comes to some of the farmers and the compressed hay out east and things like that, right? And so they face increased trucking and transportation costs to get the product to Seattle. They get a little bit of that back with the container service being less expensive in some of these bigger ports, but you have to pay the added freight to get it there in the first place.
So I guess where I'm going with this, Mr. Chair, is I think it's important for us to understand that we're restraining our growth by not being able to access those containers the way California and the state of Washington are able to. And I just want to get that on the record.
Senator Boquist.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to add, just commonality, I guess. Of all places in Veterans and Emergency Preparedness yesterday, we heard from the inland waterway maritime industry exactly the same thing is the containers, well, there is some coming upriver inbound. There is almost none going downward empty because, once again, there's no capacity. And what you see parked on the far side, on the Washington side, is going onto the Burlington Northern Railroad and up into the Seattle-Tacoma ports. And so there is a serious constraining factor, which brings us right back to the Port of Portland, and hopefully Sean O'Halloran has better brains than anybody else down there as the new appointee, and we can get something moving to the Port of Portland. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
So, thank you for the comments and the information on some of the issues you're facing in your district. But again, the issue, again, is to the extent that we muck up some of these global supply chains, then everyone's going to be a broad loser in an escalated trade war. To date, the tit-for-tat proposals does not seem to be a macroeconomic event at this point. So if we put this together, the general tracking in terms of the data flow coming in, both at the U.S. level and here in Oregon, along with discussions of economic outlook and risk to the outlook, we're looking for ongoing growth. This forecast is relatively stable, relatively unchanged from 3 months ago and 6 months ago. It's up a little bit, but not substantially so. We're in a slower growth environment today than we were a few years ago when we took all the unemployed people and underutilized resources from the Great Recession and put them back to work. And so we're in a process where we're transitioning down to more sustainable rates moving forward. We're expecting job growth to match potential labor force growth, population growth of the working age and whatnot over the next couple of years, which will still be healthy, will still be above average, will certainly be above the typical state because our population gains are also larger than seen in the typical state, but again, not quite as strong as a couple years ago.
Yeah, one quick comment on the recent employment numbers. We had April, we saw job losses in the preliminary employment numbers in Oregon. But we're not making too much of that. For one, it wasn't just Oregon. This happened for all but just a handful of states, which is extremely rare outside of, you know, being in the middle of a recession. And it certainly appears as we're starting to get some of the broader unemployment insurance records and the like, that the first quarter job gains were overstated in the preliminary data. And so this April is just coming off of some of that. And so right now we think that the true story was more of a smooth month-to-month pattern in job gains. So, so housing, migration, and homelessness, addressing a couple of the particular requests that were made by the committee, but also sort of the biggest threat that's going on in Oregon now in terms of a specific threat to the regional economy. And that's the potential for the loss of migration trends into the state, which we've argued before you guys over and over again, that this is really Oregon's primary comparative advantage. That when jobs are available here, we get folks and that want to move here. And so they bring with them not only just demand for consumer services and retail trade and the like, but more importantly, they bring a supply of skilled labor to the state. And we don't necessarily have MIT or Stanford University here, but we can get an engineer that was trained at those places to move here easily and at a discount relative to other places. And this is a real comparative advantage for our firms. But it's going to become more and more important going forward, largely because of the demographics. Here we're looking at births and deaths in Oregon. And as you see, so the gap between these two lines is what we call the natural rate of population increase. And as you see here, we expect before 2030 to get to the point in Oregon where we have more deaths than we do births. And so that means without bringing other folks in, without drawing migrants to the state as we've traditionally been able to do, we won't see any population growth here. And this is already flipped in over half the counties in the state. Across the Oregon coast and a lot of the east side of the mountains, we've seen deaths already start to outstrip births. Births here, it's not just a baby boom story. We have birth rates going down as well. And some new data just came out on that, saying that we're a good 0.5% below replacement rate as it is now. And you see it's been several years of real flat birth trends in the state. So what happens if the natural rate goes away? Well, we're dependent on migration, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Our outlook calls for continued high rates of population growth. Here, same numbers in terms of the light blue bars are the natural rate of population increase, which we see fading away. It may well be going faster than we see here, but we're still, those dark blue lines, the net migration that we're bringing in from other states remains healthy. You see here it's just as high as it was during the peak of the tech boom. Of course, not in percentage terms. We're a much smaller economy back then than we are now, but continuing to bring folks in, and that is the baseline outlook. Why is it the baseline outlook? Well, because we know the sort of people that move. When we look at migration data, it's really dominated by three things. Well, one would be young folks, People who move tend to be in their late 20s, early 30s, and or maybe almost to 40. But the young folks that are moving, and they move for employment. So the also thing we see is, people moving, if you ask them why, most people are going to say it's for a job, particularly when they're moving to or from Oregon. And finally, people are much more likely to move if they have opportunities. So people with experience and particularly higher educational levels of educational attainment. Also, we do see folks moving around. So what does that mean? Well, it means right now when we're seeing this millennial population cohort aging into their prime moving and route setting years, that's a good thing for Oregon. And so we expect to see continued rates of relatively high in-migration to the state. And so just taking a look at what do folks do, and one of the questions that Senator Boquist had for us is that, well, do folks that move here to Oregon, do they do it for public benefits or public assistance? And so that's one of the income. Obviously, it's a small relative to wage income and other things in the economy. But that is one of the things that is reported on in terms of the census income data. And so here we're comparing incomes of folks that come into Oregon with those who move out and those who don't move at all. And this tells a pretty solid story again, which is that essentially, for most of these income types, particularly the wage and salary income or whatnot, the in-migrants to Oregon tend to have, higher incomes than folks that move out. And in terms of the public assistance story, there's really very little difference with in-movers being actually a little bit less likely to take public assistance.
Senator Boquist.
I think the question, you're partly down the road of the question I was asking, so you can come back next quarter too. What Josh was pointing out is that in several revenue forecasts and in the newspapers, and I think he's correct, is that we have the in-migrants coming in many cases don't have jobs. They come here, they bring their skills and they come here, but they don't have a job instantly. So our question was more related to, are they coming here for benefits, or are the benefits creating that initial safety net for the first couple of months while they go find a job? I mean, has Nike and Intel or Tesla or somebody lured them here to work, or are they just moving here because it's a great place to live despite the Eagle Creek fire, and we have a good job market? It's that window up front. I don't think it's so much that they come here and sit around and do nothing, because we know that's not true, because they're coming in and working and they're helping grow the economy. The question is what is the draw to get them there? And I would just really jump out on the deal, considering the vote on Monday and how what people think is really out to lunch these days outside of this building, and that is that we may in fact need to have a draw to get people here, because as you point out, the population is going to go down and we're going to need skilled labor. And so we might actually need the draw to bring people here without a job to then join the workforce in the future. And that's really the question, is what you mean. And that's more of a psychology question, and I'm sure those fine academics that can say we're zero chance of the economy collapsing in the next year, I'm sure there's some psychology or sociologists in one of those universities like PSU that would pontificate on this particular issue. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Oh, yeah, thank you, Senator Boquist. And yeah, no, I think I understand your question a little better now. Yeah, so one of the reasons that folks that move here and elsewhere tend to have higher rates of unemployment is precisely because of their age profile, because of where they are in their life cycle. And young folks, young adults tend to be unemployed at higher rates. Now that is a little bit even more extreme here in Oregon. I like to say that's a good story, thinking of quality of life. You move here, you get a job here, and my spouse is willing to move here without one. That's not the case for a lot of places. And so I think some of that is potentially a good story, but I think it's really focused on the real driver is the fact of who's moving, and these are young folks.
Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I apologize for interrupting your forecast, especially as a House member in an important Senate committee. In a moment, I have to leave to get ready for emergency board, but before I do leave, I just want to point out to this committee, we are experiencing growth that we haven't seen in years. but we have a fiduciary obligation to the taxpayers to remember what was shared with us, and that this growth is not going to continue forever. And in a moment, I'll be in emergency board where we're going to be dealing with budgetary issues. And many of those budgetary issues, whether it's education or public safety or health or human services, depend upon our general fund to use as direct appropriation and as match for federal resources. And so I would hope we as a revenue committee would remind the folks in Ways and Means that we need to either be thinking about paying down obligations we have or saving reserves, because the time is going to come as an income-dependent state that we're once again going to be wondering why we didn't do that. Now is the time to do it. And so I just want to get that on the record. And to the two chairs of revenue, I sure appreciate all your leadership. Thank you for all you do. Senator Barnhart, this will probably be my last time to say it publicly. You do an A+ job as a revenue chair. Thank you.
Senator, are you running for Lee's
Oh,
position?
representative. Sorry. Yeah, it's early. On that note, I got to scoot.
Thank you, Representative Smith.
Thank you. Yes, Representative Smith. My new term is, I call this, we're in a pre-crisis period. So that's a...
Hopefully stay there for a while.
All right, so in terms of the flows, where do we get people to and from Oregon? The story is pretty stable and pretty straightforward. Here we're looking at the AGI, income gains and losses due to migration from the IRS tax data, where we follow individual taxpayers from location to location. And we have two little snapshots here, one in the midst of the recession, and then one 5 or 6 years out. And the one thing that's common and stable in our migration trends is this outflow to Washington and to a lesser extent to Idaho. And these outflows have really been going on since the dawn of time, and they're relatively stable, as you see here across the business cycle. Don't change all that much from time to time. Most of this, if you look across most of the state, this is really a suburb story. Insofar as if you look at net migration from most of Oregon to and from Washington, it's actually positive. The only place it's negative is in the Portland metropolitan area, where you lose a lot of folks, particularly across the river to Clark County and the like. And the same sort of dynamic goes on in Ontario and the east side of the state, where we do see losses in terms of net migration to and from Idaho. But the rest of the migration is really driven by our economic performance. When there are jobs here, people want to come. We always say, well, that's happened since the time of Lewis and Clark. Josh likes to say it's happened since the time of the land bridge. That when we have jobs here, people will arrive. And you see the huge increase in the big one, which is always California, but we really get them from all the warm weather, dry states and the New England and the like. And folks move here when jobs are available, and that's happening again right now. So that's encouraging, but again, it creates our biggest threat. And why is that a threat? Well, because the story we're hearing now is the concerns about housing affordability. We've really seen housing affordability erode here. It's not just an issue in our urban areas, it's across the rural areas of the state as well. And arguably, this is one of the big draws that brings people here. Not only do they have a job, but they can afford a decent place to live. And so the concern is, with the lack of construction activity and a lot of upward pressure on housing affordability, is this going to choke off our primary comparative advantage here and do some damage? So that's the big concern. For now, though, of course, we're still relatively affordable vis-a-vis California and New England and some of the biggest places that we draw folks. So maybe not as much of a concern, but we are looking at this. And one way to look at it is to say, look at, let's see, are low-income households in Oregon and Portland now getting pushed out, or are people saying they're leaving to or for housing? So we'll talk a little bit about that. But beforehand, I wanted to mention, for Senator Boquist, we put together a lot of detailed migration data for who moves and when, and did a lot of stuff for Yamhill, Polk, and Marion counties and the like. So there's a slide deck with the census and my IRS migration data that we've gone ahead and had LRO post with the meeting materials today, so you can get a deeper dive if you're interested. But with that, I'll have, oh, sorry.
Thank you for that. And then I also, just intriguing, I don't think anybody else is here is on. In rules yesterday, I think we had the largest stack of individual volunteers that I've seen since I've been here as we went through for volunteers for boards and commissions. But what was intriguing yesterday is there were more than a dozen of them whose job is telecommuted outside of the state of Oregon. They're volunteer for board and commission. They live in the Portland metropolitan area, generally speaking, and they're working in California, Hawaii, New England, elsewhere, in which they are telecommuting to senior executive level positions across the entire nation.
Interesting.
It was, I mean, it's the first time, and it jumped out completely yesterday because there were so many of them in which they're high-paying professionals living in Oregon, but their real job is not here. It's done by telecommuting from the state of Oregon.
My daughter does that.
Senator Taylor.
Thank you, Chair Hess. I was just wondering, what kind of data do you have, or do you have any way of gathering information about the folks who are moving here, who have resources, they have money, but they're not working, or they're here retired, they came with their own nest egg, if you will, but aren't actually gathering a paycheck, but have a pile of their retirement, or they have some sort of other funds and they're living off of those, but they're not getting a paycheck. And I'm not sure that we have any system to collect information about that type of a population.
Yes, Senator Taylor, we certainly do have Chair Hass. This is a phenomenon, and we, in particular, we get a lot of migrants in Southern Oregon and the coast that are retirees. Mm-hmm. And bring with them, instead of current employment and jobs and income, wealth. And and wealth is really a blind spot for our economic data in terms of what people have and how they spend out of wealth and the like. We have a lot of great data on income. And in terms of these young movers I talk about, the gold standard for economic development, the route setters who are buying houses, picking school districts and cars and the like, for whom we have a tremendous amount of data, we just don't in terms of wealth. Now, we know it's not a bad thing for economic activity, and we know some of the folks aren't just sitting on their nest eggs. In particular places like Bend, we have a lot of semi-retiree folks that are really generating a tremendous amount of economic activity. They just, leave the fast lane in California and they move to Bend and open up a shop, maybe consulting for some of their old clients, or they want to, tie salmon flies or whatever it may be. But that is economic activity as well. But in terms of just tapping the pure wealth, that's a little bit difficult, and particular from a state revenue perspective. Why? Because we've kind of tied our hands. We don't have a general sales tax. And so when folks' income turns into things that aren't taxable, like Social Security income and the like, we don't see revenue from that. And so the lack of a general sales tax and the extreme constraints that we have on our property taxes make it difficult maybe to, I don't want to use the word exploit, but I will exploit that wealth that's out there and exploit our retirees.
Follow-up, Senator Hess?
Follow-up?
Thank you. So somewhere there must be data about the number of people who are quote unquote retired
Yes.
and then moving here and then retiring. And I'm just wondering, because in the Portland area, I don't know if it's just because it's right there in front of my face, or how it may just be really, in the grand scheme of things, a very small percentage. But there's definitely some sort of cohort, I don't know how significant it is, of folks who are moving here and either not working or doing what you say, they've made their money somewhere else and they're here for quality of life, or they're just here retired. And I guess I'm concerned that, or not concerned, but that there's that it's not that they're not contributing to the economy, but their way that their income is being taxed, it's, they're not being they're able to preserve their wealth for themselves, I guess. I don't know how to exactly say it, but it just feels that there's something going on there, and that's driving probably the housing costs up so much and things like that in Portland. But I don't know how significant that is, because the housing prices are way too high for what the average income is, and so something else is causing causing those housing prices to go up, and they're getting their money from somewhere else other than a job, because something's wrong in that calculation. At least it seems to me.
That's right, Senator Taylor, and it is, I didn't mean to discount it just because the numbers are dominated by young folk. We certainly do see a lot of net migration of retirees here, and we also recently have seen a tremendous amount of increase in home equity in Portland above and beyond what we've seen in terms
I guess
of,
that would be the number.
And Senator Taylor, for the record, we just released some numbers in the study last month, or earlier this month, we created our own estimates for home equity in Portland region, because we have data, right? We matched up some different data sets in terms of home values and whether people have a mortgage or they own it free and clear, and some debt numbers, right? Put it together to look at the home equity increases in the Portland region, and there's no question we've seen a big increase in terms of whether people moving here and paying all cash for a property or not is a factor in the housing market. It's clearly one factor in the housing market, and it's on the demand side. But again, the fundamental issue in the housing market in the last decade has been the lack of supply and the under construction of
I'm not
right.
disputing
And so,
that.
but yeah, and then the other data point that we do have for at least every handful of years, again, would be specifically to the Portland metropolitan area, is what's called the American Housing Survey. They do it every 2 years, and the group of metropolitan areas in the data rotates. Portland's in it every once in a while. And in that data, they ask a question of what is the source of your down payment for the house, right? Is it just cash? Is it your wealth? Are you getting assistance or inheritance from a family member? Or are you doing no down payment? There's information along those lines. And to the extent that we're talking about younger home buyers getting into the market in recent years, both here locally and across the nation, we're seeing an increase in inheritance and gifts being a source of down payment, where basically relatively well-off parents are providing down payment assistance for their children. So we're getting some intergenerational wealth transfers via that route, which I think sounds to me is applicable to some of the questions that you're asking.
Thank you.
So yeah, how will we know if affordability is pushing folks out of Oregon and deterring them from moving here? One thing we're looking at is what's happening with the low-income households today. That might be where we would first see an impact.
That's right. The concern here is that we know we have growing geographic disparities, partly due to the housing market, where we're displacing households to the urban fringe, where people are moving out of their, some of the inner close-in neighborhoods, particularly in the Portland metropolitan area, getting pushed into East Multnomah County due to affordability. The concern here is, are we pushing them all the way out of the Portland region entirely, or out of the state of Oregon entirely, to go to Boise or Dallas or Atlanta or some of these other places that have better affordability? And by all the data that we have available to us, the answer is no. They're not leaving in greater numbers than they have historically, and the inflows of lower income households continue to outnumber the outflows. The relative shifting here does not seem to be occurring. The pattern is ongoing, as it kind of ever was among some of these lower income households, both here in the Portland region, where we have better data sample sizes, and statewide. And on the next slide, we also have a different survey of information coming from, well, why do people leave? They have 15 responses they can check in terms of what is the primary reason that they left. So are we seeing an increase in people leaving Oregon for housing related reasons, whether that's they want to own a home, they want cheaper housing, they want better housing, a better neighborhood, whatever the case may be? And we're not seeing an increase in housing related out moves. There was early in the recession, there was an uptick, but here in the last couple of years, when the affordability has been at its worst, it's actually started to taper off and decline. And some of that's just due to the noise in the data. But it's important. The other thing to point out here is that these housing related moves remain a minority of the responses. Right, people don't leave in large numbers for housing related reasons. As Mark was saying, the biggest thing, and particularly the biggest thing for interstate or cross-state migration patterns, is jobs. That dominates these discussions, both for the inflows and the outflows. Housing's a second place variable, or second place reason overall. So again, in the limited data sets we have, in terms of migration flows themselves, and then the reason why people say they're moving, we don't seem to yet see housing affordability being a driver of worsening migration trends or out migration and things like that, which is certainly encouraging. Right, that the silver lining is we're keeping all these people here for local labor supply and for society and things like that. So, on net, affordability challenges are a bad thing. The silver lining is where they're not leaving entirely due to the problems, unlike, say, in California, where we know lower income households have been leaving California in greater numbers in the last decade. Also along the lines of housing affordability, and something that was brought to the group and from Representative Marsh in particular is homelessness. This is a growing concern. This is a growing issue. We're seeing people talk about it more, and on some measures it maybe has become more visible, particularly in the urban core of some of our metropolitan areas. We have very limited data on homelessness. The best numbers out there that are consistently measured across time and across regions of the state and across regions of the country would be the HUD's point-in-time estimates, where they go out usually in January. I think the most recent one was in February, on a cold winter night, and they try and count people to the best of their abilities, both unsheltered on the streets, under underpasses and tents, things like that, but also in shelters, which is both emergency shelters and transitional housing. And to the extent that this is the best that we have, the trends over the last decade are encouraging across most of the nation. They're down 10, 15, 20% over the last decade. A lot of the research points to federal policies like Housing First and rapid rehousing, where the goal is to get people into housing as fast as you can, and then once they're there, provide the other wraparound services that they need to address some of the other issues underlying their homeless situation, the reasons why they experience homelessness. That said,
Excuse me,
in the last...
Josh, Senator Bertschiger, did you have a question?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Josh, is there any studies that, why are these people homeless? I mean, is there any reason? I mean, I've kind of talked to them in my district and I can't come up with a real answer. Is there an answer out there?
No. Chair Hass, Senator Barkshinger, yes. The short answer is yes. Along with every one of these counts where they're going out and counting the number of homeless out there, they do ask them to participate in a survey if they're willing. And so we do get survey response rates that are relatively low, but you get survey answers from some of the people that they're counting on why they're homeless. And some of them are certainly for societal reasons. Things like domestic violence is a big issue for homeless women. It also domestic violence, that's also one of the reasons. I won't go into some of the domestic violence issues related to that, but also mental health and drug addictions. There's no question that some of it's societal, some of it's economic in terms of unemployment, or they can only find a part-time low-wage job, so they have insufficient income to meet demand. But if we go to the next slide, at its root, what is homelessness, right? It's the inability to afford housing. There's other issues in play, the societal and economic issues that go into this, but at its root, there's housing. And this scatter plot comes based on some academic literature that's been done in recent years and updated by Echo Northwest for Multnomah County, and also here you see at the state level we're showing you today. There is a relationship between the share of your population that's homeless and your housing costs. It's not a perfect relationship. It doesn't fully explain everything. You see some variation in the patterns. New Jersey's really low, but New York's really high. Is that because all the people that maybe would be homeless in New Jersey, are they just moving across the river where there's better services in Manhattan or something like that? Possibly. The other one here, you see both Maryland and Virginia are really, really low, even though they have high rents. But what's not shown here is Washington, D.C., where it's off the charts in terms of the homeless population, right? So again, the geographic location, the transient nature of some of these individuals that are experiencing homelessness impacts these numbers quite a bit. But at its root, we know homelessness is at least partly a function of housing costs and inability and availability and the like.
Representative Marsh.
Thank you, Chair. This is great information, but I'm hoping as an economist you can help me kind of bridge the gap between your data and what people's experience is. Like the prior slide you described as looking better because the percentage of homeless people appears to have declined over time. And yet the experience of anybody in this room or anybody who's listening to this is that there are more people on the street. There's, the data seems to be completely counter to the expectation of anybody who's actually observing. So how do we, can you help me bridge that gap?
Yeah, Representative Marsh. One of the issues here is well, this is the only data we have, and it's an imperfect measure. We know that, and it's certainly an undercount of the absolute numbers. It also excludes things like crowded housing, where you have too many people living in a housing unit to. Maybe it's for sanitary reasons or for psychological reasons, whatever. It's a difficult living situation in and of itself. What we're also seeing is an increasing concentration of the homeless, right? In Multnomah County, according to the HUD data, the number of homeless is relatively stable in the last 6 years. It goes up and down a little bit, but it's, if you take a step back and look at the last 6 years, it's relatively stable. But we're seeing ongoing declines in Washington, Clackamas, and Clark counties, right? So the numbers for the Portland region are going down, but they're maybe stable or increasing within the urban core. And you see the same thing in the Seattle data, where the King County numbers are continuing to go up, but the Snohomish and the Pierce County numbers are continuing to go down.
Interesting.
And so that, I think, if the data was perfect and we saw these trends in the data, you could see maybe an increased visualization of the homeless issue because they're concentrated in the urban core, maybe to be closer to services or for whatever the case may be.
Follow up?
Follow up?
And yet, I suspect part of this goes back to the limitation of data. We know that, I was prompted to ask you to look at this because in our last revenue forecast, when we talked about the decline in unemployment, it was the same day in which data was released indicating that 5% of Oregon school children are homeless. So there's clearly different, we have different ways of measuring this, different tools. And to get a big picture, it seems like we have to somehow combine all those different perspectives.
Representative Marsh, absolutely. And in the next slide, we brought some information in terms of why does this matter, right? And we know, particularly regarding the students, whether they're low income or homeless in general. In general, we're talking about lower income students. Stability matters quite a bit in childhood, not just for societal reasons, but in terms of economic outcomes later in life. These are things that are seen at the societal level, at the block level, at the metropolitan level, across the nation. And so we're tied some of this into economic mobility research that came out about 4 years ago. I remember discussing it with the committees at that time. And what the chart specifically shows is what is the probability that a child is born into the bottom of the income distribution but reaches the top of the income distribution as an adult. In the U.S., it's relatively low, 9% or so at the U.S. level. Canada is higher than that. The Scandinavian countries are much higher than that. And this has been worsening over time here in the U.S. That said, not all of our communities within Oregon are low on this measure. Some are not. Some, particularly in the eastern counties, eastern parts of the state, look pretty good on this measure. Some of the ones in the southern counties do not look quite as well. But again, what does this mean? These are places that have higher economic mobility share 5 main characteristics based on the research. One of them is residential segregation. That's both income segregation and racial segregation. The role model and the peer effect, access to jobs, things like that matter quite a bit as kids are growing up. Strong families, a larger middle class, better quality public schools, things like this are all correlated, not necessarily purely causes of better economic mobility. These are all characteristics that the high mobility counties and regions have relative to the low mobility reasons. So to the extent that homelessness among students is an issue, and it certainly is, it's not just a problem today, it's going to have long-term consequences in terms of economic mobility and outcomes and incomes when they reach adulthood. And so again, we're trying to pair some of this different literature together to have a broader discussion because we know the limitations of the pure homelessness data is what it is, and it doesn't match the experiences that people seem to have. But at the same time, that's the only data that we do have. The only other thing I would add here, and what some of the national research on homelessness also points to, is the fact when we see that increasing concentration in the urban cores, declining poverty and declining homelessness in the suburbs, is it points to the fact that as of today, we have this patchwork system of local governments and nonprofits drawing on some insufficient federal programs to try and address the issues and address homelessness. But given the transient nature of the population and how these shift over time, whether they're individuals or families that are experiencing homelessness in different communities, the research is really pointing towards this should be a federal solution. Right, where instead of just having the patchwork system where local governments are trying to deal with just the particular people that are in their communities today, having a broader network of federal programs that are sufficiently funded is really where they're trying to draw the conversation. Whether that'll be successful or not, or maybe that might not even be the right opportunity. I'm not to say, but that's where a lot of the research is heading in recent years.
Okay, we have a lot of slides still to go through, including a Barnhart slide, so I'm eager to get moving here.
Yeah, okay, so moving along, first thing, a little summary or update on the peak income tax processing season. As you all know, Oregon is extremely exposed to personal income taxes, and so now that we're getting into May, we've got we're getting some sense of how the season was, and it was relatively healthy in Oregon and elsewhere across the U.S. But that said, the overall narrative that we talked about in terms of the labor market, that as we've gotten into a mature expansion, we've seen, things slow down, still healthy, still growing more than at a faster rate than the typical state. But nevertheless, we've come down from where we were in 2014, 2015 at the height of the expansion. This chart follows Oregon's tax filers, those for which we can follow the same return from year to year and match them with the past. And you'll see across the board here, in particular for wages and for business and self-employment, we've seen it ratchet down over time, with 2017 being significantly slower now than a couple of years ago. The jury's still out on some of this. Some of the flexible income, we're seeing a lot of movement from our high-income households, where they're really reporting some pretty large numbers here in terms of capital gains and some of the business income. But with our high-income households, we won't know everything until we get into the fall, when extension filers turn in their paperwork. We can tell you how much folks have paid. They have to pay by April 15th, but then we don't get the paperwork and the filing to understand exactly what the basis of that income was until later. But in terms of collections, things were relatively on track this tax season, which is the hardest part for us to forecast, is the idea of how much payments and refunds are going to go out at the beginning of the year. And I've showed this to you before. These are cumulative charts throughout the filing season. So we start in January in terms of payments, the dark red line being this year. And we don't really see much action in terms of what's deposited at the Department of Revenue until we get right about there at tax day. And then for the next couple of weeks, they really start digging through those pile of returns and sending stuff to the bank. And with refunds, the pattern's a little earlier. Folks that get refunds tend to file earlier in the process. This year there was a little bit of delay because the federal filing was delayed. But nevertheless, both of these are going to turn up around the ballpark of the forecast, where refunds are a bad thing, tax payments are a good thing, and in general they're going to come out relatively close to forecast this year. What was surprising is, in terms of our revenue forecast, is our misses this time were elsewhere, with the more stable forms of income typically. Not these year-end payments, but we saw a real surge in quarterly estimated payments we've seen, and in withholdings out of wages and salary. And this stuff, typically is the stuff that's much more stable, whereas the year-end payments can real fluctuate from year to year. But suspiciously or notably, it's not just Oregon that's seeing this. Across the U.S., we've seen a really big surge starting at the very end of 2017 in estimated payments of both personal and corporate income taxes, the likes of which we've really never seen before. And this carried into the early part of 2018. And the wage story has been the same thing in terms of withholding that we've seen here and elsewhere across the U.S. Increases in withholdings of personal income taxes above and beyond what we would expect from the labor market, what we've seen in terms of jobs and underlying wages and the things that these things are usually very highly correlated with. The story there is most likely bonus payments, where we do see when people decide to pay a lot of bonuses, which anecdotally were going on at the end of 2017 and even into March, which is the traditional bonus period. We've seen a tremendous amount of payment here. Well, why is all this going on? Why is there this shifting and a lot of estimated payments up front and a lot of bonuses being taken and the like? Well, the fact that it's going on across the U.S. Suggests that it's a similar cause across states. And what people are pointing toward is tax reform, particularly the federal tax reform and the incentives that are created there. And the main one, we saw a lot of publications at the time and newspapers saying, oh, you want to prepay your state taxes because they're going to limit this and the federal return and things like that. We don't allow that in Oregon, but there is certainly a clear incentive across both tax types, corporate and personal, was to try to pull as much of the cost side of your ledger into 2017 when rates were high and push as much of the income as you can out into 2018 or 2019 when taxes were low. In terms of the bonus payments, there's a perverse incentive on both sides. You can either, a lot of folks would want to take those labor costs, if you're an employer, you want to take those labor costs in 2017, but maybe if you're on the board of directors and you're getting a big payout, you might want that in early 2018. So we've seen both, and this increase, is a big driver of the upward revision that we're going to see in this quarterly forecast. And so the upward revision was created by some of these behavioral impacts and responses to the tax law, for which we don't know if, to the extent that this is just timing, that might not be permanent. So in the forecast, we're taking some of this out as we go forward. If people pay a lot today, they may owe less tomorrow. And when we follow things like refunds applied forward, where people say, oh, don't send me my refund check, just go ahead and apply it to my next tax bill, there's a lot of that activity going on as well. So we expect some of this surge to be temporary, but nonetheless, some of it does indicate a bigger economy and a stronger fundamental revenue picture. But also, in addition to that, we're getting a lot of revenue support from the direct impact of tax law changes, particularly associated with the federal tax legislation. I won't go through all the details here, but you see down at the bottom, using the LRO scores that you folks have been working with, each and every biennium we're getting hundreds of millions of dollars, including the current biennium at $241 million of just this direct impact of federal tax law. So that's helping push these increases in revenues, and as a result, we've revised significantly upward our forecast for the current round. So quick risks going forward.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
back on
Barnhart.
the previous slide. I wonder if you have or could provide a breakdown of that first item. You've got a bunch of different things in that one set of numbers.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
It might be helpful for planning purposes to know how much is in each of those categories and if there are any other categories.
Thank you, Chair Barnhart, Chair Barnhart and Chair Haas. Yes, so the big ones, and Chris can correct me if I'm wrong, I think there are all sorts of provisions in the Federal Tax Act, and that do feed through. I think the two big ones that are left that move the needle for personal income taxes are the business accounting is supposed to be important, although uncertain, and capital expensing, this accelerated depreciation, the Section 179 expensing concept, where you can take your depreciation up front. That feeds through to our flow-through entities. And the third big one is the indirect effect of we pay less federal taxes, and so now we owe more Oregon tax because we can take a smaller deduction for federal taxes because of the deductibility of federal taxes. So I think those are the three biggest components of the effect of the Tax Act on us. On the corporate side, it's the same story. In particular, this bonus depreciation, the numbers are very, very large for that. But they're also uncertain, the bonus depreciation numbers, and I know Legislative Revenue Office has worked really hard on this. If you take just the raw numbers that come out of the Joint Committee on Taxation in Washington, these revenue impacts would be just massive. And so I think Chris has worked and his office has worked to make these a little bit more reasonable, but they're still pretty big in terms of numbers and the impacts. And the other one that maybe bears a little bit of mentioning because it's a little unusual is the repatriation revenues that are coming from international companies that are bringing their earnings back on shore. They're being forced to by the federal government, and as a result, we are getting some indirect impact from this. The reason I mention it is because the budget implications of this aren't as extreme as the revenue side of this. For our purposes, we have to count all of this corporate money as general fund money for the statutes that govern us, the kicker law and the balanced budget statute and the like. So we have to count all of this as it comes in. But policymakers are a little more skeptical because of the uncertainty of this number, and so they've taken 145 out of the $245 million and are dedicating that and transferring it to other funds to deal with some of our unfunded liability that was going to happen in the next budget period. So some of these numbers you're going to be really huge for corporate income taxes. In fact, we've triggered a large corporate kicker right now on the order of $197 million right now as a result largely of this, of the tax law changes. But that said, that doesn't mean there's going to be $245 million of available resources because some of it's been dedicated already by the legislature.
Mr. Chair, if I could follow up.
Yes.
Just briefly. I understand the issue involving depreciation versus expensing of plant and equipment. My understanding of it, however, is that what the effect of that would be to reduce income during times of expansion and increase it after that. And so some of these things may cut the other direction rather than up. They may cut down for the first year or two before they catch up. Am I onto something, or have I missed it entirely?
Yeah, I think, yes, Representative Barner, I think you're onto something. The pattern of this typically is, expensing or accelerated depreciation. The way I think of expensing is just accelerated depreciation in 1 year, right? And so rather than over time. But all of those give you an incentive to, okay, we're going to pull and recognize more of these costs up front, right? And so as you recognize those costs up front, you get a bulge, and then over time, then it will become a positive because people will not have those costs to write off in future years.
But, and if I may, that's the reason why I'm asking for a breakdown in these items, because I suspect some of them in the first year might be negative.
Absolutely, that's right, and they certainly are. And in terms of the corporate, unfortunately, that's overwhelmed by this big repatriation number. But if not for that, it would certainly be negative.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. Okay. So moving on. Capital gains, always a risk with the stock market volatility and the like. But in terms of where we are on the personal side, we're also now in the realm of a kicker, in part due to increases in the changes in the tax law, and in part due to other forecast changes, both indirect influences of the tax law and improved economic outlook going forward. Here you see the evolution of our personal income tax kicker base, which includes not only personal income taxes, but everything in the general fund outside of corporate taxes. And as of this forecast, you see we've also included the small impact of what was passed on Monday. It's already folded in here, but it does put us above the 2% kicker threshold. We're now at 3% higher than the close of session forecast, which would generate a kicker of $555 million that goes out then when people file their taxes in 2020 or in 2019.
So much for Senator
Mr. Chair,
Yes, Representative
I have
Finley.
a question. I'm trying to follow the numbers and I'm somewhat confused. It appears by looking at that as a result of increased revenue due to Senate Bill 1528, we brought in $245 million additional dollars. We then reached the threshold for the kicker, which we now have to spend $555 million on the kicker. So we should be ending the year at about $300 million in the hole. Am I not getting that? Am I reading that wrongly? But that doesn't look like good math.
Representative Finley, Chair Haas, this is there's a lot of moving parts here, and this is a really complicated one to explain. But I will do my best. So first of all, with our recently enacted pass-through deduction piece, as you mentioned here, the Senate Bill 1528, it's not appropriate, although technically it's the case that without that tax law, there wouldn't be a kicker in the baseline right now. That's difficult to do. In general, there's always so many moving pieces to this, that we have this mistake that's plus 200, this one that's minus 200, and adding them all up, we hope that the God of offsetting errors will save us like they usually do. And so at the end, it's hard to take just one piece and isolate it. And in particular, this one is maybe not appropriate because in terms of the context of the kicker, we're comparing today's forecast to what was forecast at the close of session back when the legislature was in session in the odd number year. So, what was going on then? Well, we didn't have the federal tax bill out, and we didn't have a 20% deduction that we, as you'll see at this. When LRO talks about the connection to federal taxable income versus AGI, there's just a handful of states that had to take that 20% deduction in their own income as well, and we were one of them. But then after the Senate passed the fix, well, then that 245 went away. So you see in our graph here, it's a minus and a plus. So relative to the close of session, which sets the bar for the kicker, there has been really no change on this one dimension, right? The legislative action just put us back to where we were then. And so as much as I'd like to blame the errors on the policymakers here, this one I think we have to own because, on this one dimension of federal tax law, there hasn't been a change relative to the close of session.
But I'm sorry, but I'm kind of linear. It appears that because of the federal tax changes, there was an acceleration of some of the tax payments in the end of December because of perhaps a disallowance in the following year. So that resulted in an acceleration of payments. And then with the changes that we've made in the short session, on top of that appears to me, and I'm just a linear person as I move from left to right, it certainly appears that when the smoke all clears, we're going to be $300 million in the hole.
Yeah, so the accounting is complicated, and I'm going to do my best here on the next slide to try to walk through it. But the main issue here that makes it so it's not a massive hole that you would think, okay, we're going to pull $555 million out of the revenue stream. The reason that might be misleading is because, well, why do we have that kicker? Well, because we got a lot more money today in the current biennium than we expected. And so unless we take that money out to the burn barrel in the backyard, on net, things don't look so bad. And also, maybe we got some of this money because the economic and revenue situation is better than we thought, which will carry forward, and we got a higher jump-off point, and then going forward, maybe more growth than we expected before, coming from a larger base. And so those two things kind of combine.
Got a couple of questions. Senator Boquist, you were in queue.
Right, and I mean, a couple of points for members and the public to remember here, because tax policy is quite complex, as our good state economist just tap danced across quite eloquently. We need to keep in mind that the accelerated payments is one time, so that's the first issue we need to keep in mind.
Yeah.
The second thing is that the SB 1529 money, this is the corporate, this is really one-time money, so we need to keep in mind and not spend it, and we appropriately, in a bipartisan manner, all recognize that so far and haven't spent that. So, three other points that are out there that we need to sort of keep in mind. There is a over-reliance to talk about accelerated depreciation in Section 179, but the fact of the matter is, under federal law, in December of virtually every year since all of us have been here, me 13, 14 years, is the federal government has put a accelerated depreciation or a Section 179. This one just happens to be slightly larger. So that anomaly, our state economists have accurately forecasted, despite Congress always doing it generally on the 29th or 30th of December of every year of accurately forecast. The other thing that's not in here that needs to be warned to everybody, that is in sort of, I guess the right, I don't know what the economic term, but in a perverse twist of fate in capital gains, and that is that, and we won't see this because in capital gains from the stock market, there is not a penalty for the sophisticated taxpayer to make payments until the end, and that is that we're going to see a bump, and I'm guessing it's in here to some extent, we just don't know what it is, in which when the market does a downturn, and in this particular cycle, in February and in April of this year, pick your poison from the economists, somewhere between an 18 and 22% downturn transpired and the market rebounded. However, those capital gains that were taken by those taxpayers are going to come in as a one-time shot in the arm to us. As example, in 2008, 2009, with a $4 billion Oregon tax base in capital stocks in that particular arena, we had a 14% change and saw this huge bump. And so now we're looking with a $7 billion base and a 20% market correction that we're going to see this huge cash flow come in one time. And of course, the poor state economists aren't going to have even the slightest clue until January 15th, because the sophisticated person isn't going to pay it till then, or might not realize it until their April 15th filing. And so we're going to see even more volatility out as we get into the beginning of the next legislative session in this whole revenue scheme. It's going to sort of be all over the place. And so I would caution members before we start jumping up and down on what we're going to do and how we're going to do it, that it's going to get worse in terms of figuring out what to do into the future.
Certainly, too, Senator Boquist, always the hardest for us to forecast. Absolutely true that the capital gains related revenue is much more volatile than even the underlying stock market, right? Because what happens when you start to see a stock market correction is, well, people start to, there's a lot of volume of trades, and they start to cash in gains that they may have held for 8-10 years, on paper. And so even though the price of stocks is going down, people are cashing in this mountain of unrealized gains, and so temporarily our tax receipts are inflated or held up, even though the market's turning down, but then the bottom drops out. And that's what happened in the last stock market cycle, when we went from $10 billion of realized capital gains to $2 billion overnight. So that's a much bigger drop than we see in the underlying equity prices.
Representative Barnhart, did you have a question?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to go back to slide 22. And then also look at the slide where you show the big changes in the blocks. I think it's 25. But this one is very confusing to me. I look at the actions that we took on 1528 and 1529. And if I understand this correctly, and I do the arithmetic correctly, without 1528, the biennial number here would be minus, the total on the personal income tax would be minus $123 million instead of plus $122 million. Based on these law changes, that's what you're described here. Similarly, on the 1529, it looks to me as though the net would be $1 million up instead of $241 million up. If we had not passed Senate Bill 1529. Have I understood that correctly based on this chart?
Yes, Chair Barnhart, I do believe that's the correct
Well,
interpretation.
then let's go to 25 then. And I want to quarrel a little bit with the way you've presented that, and maybe you've already admitted that you've not presented it right. I wasn't certain from what you'd said earlier. But it looks to me as though the pass-through piece that you've stuck there is simply a net, a wash. It isn't a separate item.
I see. Yes, yeah. And I wanted to point out that it's a wash relative to the close of session. But if you look at the timing here, when the federal law was passed, that was before our March forecast, we realized that the connection to federal taxable income was going to create this revenue hit for us, where now our pass-through income in Oregon taxable becomes lower. And so as of the March forecast, we had, just as you described, a $245 million revenue hit because of our connection to the federal tax law. And so then, after the legislative action in the even year session, erased that. And so that's the plus 245 later.
Right.
So yeah, relative, so it's when we're talking about relative to the kicker base and relative to the close of session, where really nothing's happened. But you're absolutely right. As this has evolved, we went from originally taking a hit from the federal government to the legislature fixing that, and they did the same sort of fix for the goofy repatriation dividend received deduction.
That's an excellent point, though. Because it wasn't. If you take out the word technically, for practical purposes, it wasn't a revenue gain as much as it prevented a revenue loss.
And if I could follow up on that, Mr. Chair, that's exactly the point I'm making. Looking at this chart, the way you've presented it, makes it appear as though somehow or another we've increased revenue by $245 million when all we did was prevent the $245 million loss otherwise caused by the federal tax law change. If you simply left those two columns out altogether, it would still present an accurate picture, would it not?
Yes, Chair Barnhart. It's just difficult to explain, particularly as most of our materials are all talking about, well, how much has the forecast changed in the last 3 months and why? And so what I didn't want to do is, how's it changed since the last time I was in front of here? Oh, well, it's up because of legislative action, and that's a big enough number to put us in kicker range. I didn't think that was an appropriate way to describe it. But yeah, because most of the materials here, it's all about, well, how has our forecast evolved from the last time? And what were the impetus of those changes? But I think you need the broader time period to understand that this wasn't a tax increase, but just a fix and patching the revenue loss that we saw.
Well, thank you. And if I could, Mr. Chair, I think it would be useful. People look at these kinds of charts pretty simplistically. All the discussion you and I are having really, it may not matter to somebody out there looking at these charts. It would be really great if we could have a chart that showed the end of session forecast and the net changes that have occurred since then. Net meaning things that simply cancel each other out don't show up. Mm-hmm. That would be helpful.
Okay, I'll go ahead and follow up on that after the meeting.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that.
For that.
This is a similar kind of concern that I've expressed in the past when you have talked about changes without pointing out what the denominator was.
That's right.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair,
Senator
I
Bocas.
fully support the good chair of the House Revenue's proposal to add an additional slide so we see what the net is. I am opposed to removing slides and hiding from the public the transparency and the steps in the law, because that's what the state economist has to do by law, is start at the close of session and then walk down these things. So I'm fully supportive, and I fully agree let's get a net on here as proposed, but let's make sure we don't take something off that the state economist is required to do by law and the public wants to see anyway. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chair, I wasn't proposing taking
I'm just
anything away.
I'm just clarifying here.
So if there's anyone left who isn't confused, we can fix that now with the next chart. What's going on with this evolution and in terms of available resources, which is what everybody here fundamentally cares about. So the starting point, back to Representative Finley's question, what happened to revenues in the current biennium? That's that top left-hand $810 million increase for today's revenues. How does that break down? $500 million from tax law changes directly, and then $300 million from other stuff, both the indirect tax law changes that we're working in and increase in our forecast. Increase in our forecast has two parts. One is the tracking that I mentioned before. We're getting a lot. We've had a lot in the door and are running ahead of projections. And second being a little bit more economic growth expected in the outlook. That comes largely from the fact that in last March, we didn't have the spending part of the fiscal stimulus plan. We had the tax part. We didn't have this budget bill at the federal side, and that increased growth a little bit more as well. And so 500 in direct tax law changes, 300 in other stuff gives us 800 million in revenues. We adjust.
Representative.
Oh, sorry.
Let him finish.
So we adjust that for increased expenditures during the last session and the like, add our lottery funds, and we end up with today $772 million more in revenue in this current biennium than we expected in March. So that's a pile, but then a lot of it's going to come off in the next biennium. Depending upon how much the legislature chooses to spend out of that today versus save in reserves for the next biennium, that is going to determine the size of the impact next time. So next time you see here we have a negative impact on revenues of 219. There are two things there. There's the kicker that everyone knows, the $555 million kicker is coming out. And then there's also this transfer out of the repatriation money. We think it's going to be about $145 million. So those are the two big pieces. But we do have some additional growth in there, so it's not a 100% reduction relative to March. But nevertheless, it's a significant $222 million reduction in what we expect next biennium. So you put these two together is the way I like to think about it, because we don't have a spending plan for the next biennium yet. The story would be $550 million in increased resources for the two biennia put together, depending on when you want to use it.
Representative Nelson, did you have a question?
So I feel like there's been times in here where we said our lottery revenue is going to go down, and it hasn't. Has the casino in Washington not done as well, or not hit us as badly as we thought? People don't want to drive and sit in traffic to get one.
Precisely, Representative Nuss. We have not, when the Cowlitz Casino was announced just north of the border, we put a very significant impact on lottery. 25% reduction in video lottery, which is the driver. The argument for that was just the huge volume of sales that we do in North Portland and Park Rose and Hayden Island. Over time, those have not come true yet.
People don't want to drive to gamble. The traffic is one advantage to traffic.
Yes, and there are a lot of issues going on with the grant. Those still have yet to come true. The same sort of issues happening with the projections made for the Spirit Mountain Casino. They're not seeing the kind of losses they expected. Yeah. So now we've moved. We keep creeping up this outlook to what we see here, although this is just a change relative to March. The qualitative nature of the outlook now is instead of revenue losses, we just have a couple of flat years, or a flat year or two in terms of sales, and then come up. But that too may turn out to be a little bit too conservative.
We'll see.
Okay.
But yeah, so for now, right now we're just expecting just a soft patch in lottery revenues, and then eventually growing along with everything else. Not as fast as underlying income, but as the economy grows, so too do sales.
Senator Burchard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On the revenue forecast, going into 1921, no, but if the economy keeps accelerating, doesn't flatten off, that number will probably be reduced. Would that be a good statement?
In terms of if we continue, I think it would be a good statement. The really both in our underlying economic forecast and in the revenue forecast, we just have this soft patch in this 2021. It's been there for a long time, and there are a lot of reasons for it, both in terms of the pullback of the federal fiscal stimulus, increasing monetary policy. We have the ramping up of our minimum wage and inventory issues and all sorts of things that would kind of point toward that period as a potential soft spot. And we have this in our forecast right now. That is something that we're really going to obsess about between now and when we meet you next time. Why? Because this is the traditional mistake that our office makes. As we're getting at the very end of a cycle, we start to say, oh, well, things are slowing down and we got a weekend, but then we'll have a couple of darn good years just before the bottom drops out. And that's when we give out these, big kicker payments, is when we'll get this, big year just at the end when things are about to turn down. Then we finally talk ourselves into cranking up the forecast, and that's when the bottom drops out and we miss on both sides. And so that's really what we're obsessing over now. It's very hard to time the downturn, but it does appear that if we continue to see growth, I think that would increase our outlook.
The reason I say that, Mr. Chair, is from a business perspective, is we have high confidence right now, and businesses are pumping money in to grow, to expand business. So you'll see lower income now because they're taking their profits, they're putting in their growth. We'll see the benefit of that growth later on, and so I'm thinking that number will be significantly less, just based on my gut instincts, for whatever that's worth.
So yeah, moving on. We have a couple of relatively soft biennia expected in the forecast. Before it was 17-19. This is the direct impact of the new kicker on growth in 1921 as well. Now is going to be less than 10% over the biennium, but that would be a normal sort of year. You wouldn't see the sort of slow down in growth rates and then the speed up. If not for that kicker, it would be a much more stable underlying outlook that's being paid out of there. So finally, last comment is that it's really not just about the revenue in the general fund that we talk about. We're worried, piggybacking off of Representative Smith's comments, and this, we have to worry about the fact that we're in a pre-crisis period right now, which I completely agree with. But some encouraging things are happening outside of our backyard, which is the general fund. The biggest being, I always talk about these reserves, that Oregon now has reserves, which it's never had before, because we have automatic deposits into the Education Stability Fund and the Rainy Day Fund. But also importantly are some of the cost containment efforts that this body's been putting together that are starting to bear fruit. Senate Bill 1067 is significant, and as we've mentioned earlier today, we're talking about to what extent, like in Senate Bill 1529, to what extent can we take one-time revenues or whatever and try to apply them to some of these unfunded liabilities of the state. And so I think, we're in a much better place in terms of the more broad financial management of the state than we have been going into previous recessions. And I think a lot of that has to do not just on the revenue side, where sometimes reform can be very, very difficult in an uphill battle, but on the management side, both in terms of these cost containment efforts like 1067 and the squirreling away of reserves for the rainy day.
Thank you for that. On 1067, I know you're compiling some research on that. Is there a ballpark number there? I could say 50 million, 100 million since.
Yeah. Right now, we haven't been able to improve upon the original estimates that scored it when we passed the bill, but the budget staff should be hopefully being able to follow up on that in the future. But right now, the data is not available.
Representative Smith-Warner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Am I reading this right? However, though, that according to that, the effective reserves right now are a little lower than they either were or were projected? Or, oh, I'm sorry, no, I'm reading it backwards. I was thinking that was 15, yeah, no. So they're lower now than they are projected to be at the end of the biennium. So you're saying they're on track, they're at this point now, and by the end of the biennium, okay.
That's correct.
Those numbers were all flipping
And
around.
to have had reserves like this in the two recessions we went
Absolutely.
through, in 01, 02, and 08. This is a
Yep.
game changer for Oregon's tax code. This is just really phenomenal. This is what everybody wanted, and very healthy.
Okay, and thank you. So as always, oh, I'm sorry. I forgot the most important part. We're losing House Chair Barnhart very soon, and just wanted to thank him for all the help he's given us, explaining all of the convoluted things that we say, and he's been really guided our office for quite some time. He'll be the last remaining member of either of these committees since we started this. So last man standing, last one who could actually tell you that a $550 million kicker really isn't that big, and you should go out there and tell everybody know that it could be much worse. So yeah, just a thanks to Chair Barnhart, and good luck.
Okay, Chair Barnhart.
I didn't realize that.
Any questions to our two state economists? This was an economic forecast for the ages. Appreciate that. Sometimes you have highlights, sometimes you don't. If there are,
I have one request, please, Senator Hess. And following up on the request that Chair Barnhart had about maybe adding the additional slide for the clarification that he brought up, perhaps it would be useful to have an additional slide explaining in more detail about with the one-day session we had on Monday about the relationship between that and 1528 and the kicker, just so that the public understands that in a little bit more detail, I think would be useful, please, from your office. Thank you.
if we have no further questions, then I will dismiss our economists. And the Senate is still in session, and we're going to move into a work session for some business. House members, you're welcome to stick around. Otherwise, I understand.
We dismissed House members.
I'll open up the public hearing and work session. And we'll stand at ease here for a minute. We do have somebody signed up. Jody, did you want to testify on this? Well, let me first back up. We are before us looking at the appointment of Chris Alanak as the permanent legislative revenue officer, and this comes after a process of about 3 months or so of searching and finalists and interviews, and so he's been named, and it requires ratification of the House Revenue Committee and the Senate Revenue Committee. So in the course of that, there's also a public hearing, and Jody, you have signed up to testify, so go ahead.
So I felt really rotten yesterday when there was no kind of recognition in the other committee of how it is a great thing for those of us in the back of the room, as well as those of you in the front of the room, that we have somebody with that kind of quality holding this position. And we're really pleased with the appointment that those of you who worked on the appointment made, because we know that Chris gets us good information and hires well, and that's important stuff. So thank you.
Okay, thank you for coming forward and testifying, and I would echo those same comments, and
Let's see how we vote first.
yeah. Any discussion?
So just as long as we are in a work session, I don't want to do this twice.
We are in work session.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move to approve Chris Alanak as the Legislative Revenue Officer. And I'd like to tell you he's the ex-ist Revenue Officer, but I don't know what number he is since Dr. Warner here, his predecessor, who has big shoes to fill, was here for so long, none of us have a memory.
Senator Boquist moves for the approval of Chris Alanak as the Legislative Revenue Officer. Any discussion?
Thank you for being unwise enough to do this.
Any objections? Seeing none, Chris Alanak is now the permanent Legislative Revenue Officer. Congratulations. Okay, let's put the guy to work. Very briefly, and I think it's very apropos of this discussion we just had, and it's a very little known nuance in Oregon's tax code that we begin our calculations at the starting point at the federal taxable income instead of AGI, which is where about 40 states do that. And if we had been one of those states, we wouldn't even have had this discussion about the federal tax bill, the deductibility, 1528. And so I've been curious as well, how did we get to this? What are the benefits? Should we switch? What are the trade-offs? And so we're going to spend a few minutes discussing how we got here and whether it would ever make any sense to change.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. So to set this up, Ledge Counsel is here to provide some of the legal interpretation. As part of the confusion, I think, stems from a couple places. One, there isn't a specific statute that says the Oregon income tax starts here. So it's not a place that we can point to and they can look at it and they can see those words. It's more contextual. So Ledge Counsel is going to go through that. And to set that up, there are 3 documents in OLIS. One of them is just a listing of the states. So I wasn't going to go through that, but people can reference that. There are about 30 states that tie to AGI, about 6 states that tie to federal taxable income like us, another 6 or 7 states that do something entirely different. Perhaps they only tax interest and dividends, and then about 6 or 7 states that don't have an income tax. Another thing that's in OLIS here, and I think Kate might touch on it a little bit, is Form 40, which is our main personal income tax return. And most of this discussion will be from the personal income tax side. That's a little more intuitive for folks, but it does apply to corporations as well. We have page 2 of the Form 40, which is the Oregon tax return. So when Oregonians go to file their taxes, they pull out this form, and that first line, even though it's line number 7, is federal AGI. So when people go to look, they can think this is where we start, and this is where we're connected. But that's just a convenience the way the form is structured. So I think Kate was going to provide some legal background, and then when she's done, there's a conceptual document here that talks about some of the pros and cons and some of the advantages.
Okay. Kate, if you want to come forward and don't get too legalese on us.
Good morning, Chair House, members of the committee. I'm Kate Tossell from the Office of Legislative Counsel. And just briefly, I wanted to touch on the connection between, or at least the starting point and the connection between Oregon taxable income and federal taxable income. I know that there's been some confusion that's come up, certainly in the previous session, in the 2018 session, but also in the past. I think I've received questions about this issue, and I think, as Chris indicated, it is due to people looking at the form. But it's important to remember that actually the statutes and the Constitution and the law drive the form and not the reverse. And in order to understand this, even at a higher level, if one looks through ORS Chapter 316, which is the personal income tax chapter, a lot of this also applies to 317, which is the corporate chapter, but I'm going to concentrate on Chapter 316. There are a number of sections in there that address policy definitions and then also the interaction between federal law and state law. And to start out right at the beginning of Chapter 316 is the policy statement, and it sets forth the legislative intent for Chapter 316. And it indicates, to paraphrase, that the intent of the Legislative Assembly is to make the Oregon Personal Income Tax chapter identical in effect to the provisions of the code relating to the measurement of taxable income, and then also to achieve the result by applying the provisions of the code that relate to the definition of taxable income, with then modifications, adjustments at the state level, which then results in a final amount called taxable income, and then imposing a tax on residents of the state measured by taxable income. So that's all in 316.07, which is the policy statement for Chapter 316.
Can I stop you right there? How old is that statute? And did you previously mention Constitution too?
Chair House, members of the committee, that section was initially enacted in 1969, and it was part of the Personal Income Tax Act of 1969. You actually still see in Chapter 316 that that short title still applies to Chapter 316. So in 1969, the initial provisions of 316, which is now the Personal Income Tax chapter, were enacted, and also a provision that was then added to the Oregon Constitution and approved by the voters in 1970 was enacted. And if we look at that, that provides for our rolling reconnect. So in 1969, we see that both of these provisions, the provisions that later became Chapter 316, and then also the Oregon constitutional provision providing for the rolling reconnect, those were both put in place. And that's Article 4, Section 32. Article 4, Section 32 doesn't specifically refer to taxable income, but it enables the legislature to essentially pick up changes that are made by Congress on a rolling basis. It's an exception to the idea that we see elsewhere that the legislature cannot delegate its authority to another sovereign. In other words, in most situations, we cannot use a reference to federal law that changes in the future. We can't pick up rolling changes made by Congress. Because of Article 4, Section 32, that enables the legislature to pick up changes in federal law that relate to the definition of income. It doesn't actually use the term taxable income, but it refers to the income upon which the tax is imposed.
Okay, so in 1969, was there a policy rationale for making that change?
The best that I can understand from looking at this and then also looking at the voters pamphlet from the election in 1970, when Article 4, Section 32 was ratified, was that a lot of it was for the sake of consistency and simplicity. So there was a personal income tax, but with these statutes, and there was I think, pretty significant bill, the Personal Income Tax Act of 1969, it set forth consistency, and it also made clear that the connection point was taxable income.
Okay, and Senator Riley, did you have a question?
Yes, I did. You mentioned in the Constitution it allows us to use a rolling connection. Does it require it?
The chair has Senator Riley. It does not, it's permissive. It does not require that. It enables the legislature to pick up those changes. And throughout Chapter 316, actually throughout the tax chapters, you see there are instances where there are dates, dates that refer to connections to the code, typically December 31st of the previous year. Those generally relate to provisions in our statutes that don't deal with taxable income. Then there are other places within the tax chapters that refer to, that actually it sets out, if related to the definition of taxable income as applicable to the tax year of the taxpayer. We even have some statutes where it's sort of a hybrid, where if it's dealing with the definition of taxable income, it picks up changes throughout the year, congressional changes, also known as the rolling reconnect, but where there may be other applications, it does need to have that date updated. And then there are the numerous sections where it does have the date, and if we don't connect, we don't pick up those changes.
I just want to make it clear that the Constitution doesn't require us to do that.
Is that if for some reason we wanted to change the calculation to go to the AGI, we wouldn't have to worry about the Constitution?
The chair has Senator Riley. The wording of Article 4, Section 32 is permissive. It says may define, notwithstanding any other provision of this Constitution, legislative assembly, any law imposing a tax, etc., in respect to or measured by income, may define the income with respect to or by which such tax or taxes are imposed or measured, by reference to any provision of the laws of the United States. So it's permissive throughout. It doesn't actually use the term taxable income. So if there were some other form of income upon which we were imposing a tax, arguably that would also be taxable income. But yes, we could depart from this and say we want to stay, we don't want to have the rolling reconnect any further. We want to stay disconnected. This is more permissive and is saying, unlike all these other situations where there's this prohibition against delegation, we're allowing delegation. We're saying we can pick up federal changes in federal tax law as they occur without needing to put in a date and update that date, if that helps.
Senator Boquist.
Just 2 quick points, and I think, Council, you said you studied the ballot measure, and so therefore I'm just going to make it easy for myself, and because I'm lazy. I'd like to get the data or the information, because obviously you pulled out the ballot measure. Sometimes filing out the ballot measure that went to the ballot in 1970. So if I could get that information from you, not here obviously, but outside here. And the other thing is that just a slight correction, which you'll agree to, Council, is that the desire or not desire of the legislature to make a change is permissive, but the actual article, section 32 itself, does require the legislature to review this at its regular sessions and at any special sessions coming. That is not permissive. It says the legislature shall review the definition of income if we're going to tamper. That is in the last 2 lines, the actual last full line.
Chair House, Senator Boquist. Senator Boquist is exactly right. There is the final sentence of Article 4, Section 32 that says, at each regular session, the Legislative Assembly shall, and at any special session may, provide for a review of the Oregon laws imposing a tax upon or measured by income. But no such laws will be amended or repealed except by a legislative act. So yes, this requires review.
Full employment for you.
But it doesn't require any particular outcome as to whether there would be legislation recommended or that stemmed from the outcome of that review. But yes, Senator Boquist is exactly right. There is that final sentence that calls for, and it is, that's not permissive. It has a shall in it, requiring a review of the Oregon laws imposing a tax upon or measured by income. And that's a phrase we see throughout the tax statutes, imposed upon or measured by income.
Senator Burchard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I've got it. We can connect or disconnect. We can do that. Got that part. But does the Constitution tell us where what's the latitude of where we can connect and disconnect? Do we have a lot of latitude there?
Chair Hess, Senator Berchiger, this is the entirety of the provision, and it says that the Legislative Assembly, in any law imposing a tax or taxes on, in respect to or measured by income, may define the income on, in respect to or which by such taxes are imposed or measured by reference to any provision of the federal, just to paraphrase the federal law. So it's saying our definition of income can basically possess that quality of having the rolling reconnect. It is not saying, it does give us some latitude, but I think if you read it in the totality of what existed at the time that this was enacted, they're talking about taxable income, even though that phrase isn't used in this section, but it's the income upon which the taxes are imposed.
So did the federal government during this time use adjusted gross income on their tax forms?
Chair Hass, Senator Berchiger, both of these terms are terms that we find throughout federal law and our own state statutes. So I would have to look further to see exactly where that intersection happened. But I can say that the provisions that we have in Chapter 316, viewed in the light, and there was history before 1969. I think 1969 kind of consolidated and made more cohesive the existing provisions and made clear that there was this connection. There is a principle that we look at what the intent of just like we look at legislative intent, we look at the intent of the voters when they vote on something that is going to amend the Oregon Constitution or that is going to enact a new provision in the Oregon Constitution. And that was the universe that people were looking at that point, and that's reflected in the voters' pamphlet from the 1970 election where this was enacted.
The reason, Mr. Chair, that I say that is, I don't mind, changing where we connect. I get all that, in fact, I'd look forward to a longer conversation. I just don't want to go down this road and spend all of the 19th session, working on this and coming to a point and passing something, and then somebody takes it to court and challenges it based on the Constitution. See where I'm going?
And wins.
And wins.
Senator Boquist.
I just want to simplify this, neither agreeing or disagreeing, is the option of changing to AGI in our toolbox or not in your read? That's a simple question.
Chair Haas, Senator Boquist, one thing I would caution is part of the reason it's clear that we connect to taxable income, in addition to these, there's a policy section, there's a definitional section, there's a section, which is 316.012, that indicates that we have, the terms have the same meaning in our code as in the Internal Revenue Code. There's also many other sections in the tax chapters that use the language indicating that there's a subtraction from or an addition to federal taxable income. There are numerous provisions. Our tax expenditures, for the most part, the ones that aren't credits, that is how they're worded. That's how they're constructed. So there's a whole structure within this, in addition to the policy statement, which is clear and is also contemporaneous with the constitutional provision. Then there's the rest of the sections in these chapters that set forth this is how this is structured. So I think just for that reason, mechanically, this would be difficult, but then it's also, it would be a serious policy departure, I think, to start doing that. Whether that's even possible with the framework what we have, it's not just a question of saying, well, we're now connected. We'd have to look at all these other provisions and how they interact with each other and with the sections that don't actually deal with tax expenditures. So I think that's worth noting.
It'd be a pretty serious piece of legislation, wouldn't it?
And Chair House, I think that's right.
Yeah. Senator Taylor.
Thank you, Chair Hess. So with that being said, can you enlighten us a little bit more when you say that? Are there 10 different things that need to be changed? Is there 20 things? Is there a significant amount? Can you put in some sort of context, either financially, the number of statutes, something to have you say a significant change?
Chair House, Senator Taylor, I'd say it's dozens, probably within 316 and 317, okay. But then it's the interaction between and among those sections, and there would have to be a policy overview of how this all fits together, I think, to take that step. And as far as financially or monetarily, that is not, I think that's outside of my bailiwick. Thank you. Probably at least several dozen statutes would be implicated by this discussion.
So thank you. What you mean? It's full employment till your retirement. So just beyond that, but what I think I really hear you saying is that in theory we could change to AGI, but it could be suspect and could be challenged in the court.
Chair,
I asked you
Chair House, Senator Boquist, I believe that. I think we'd have to look very closely at Article 4, Section 32, and certainly there may be challenges, and I don't know that that's why that provision was written. I don't know that it's written envisioning that, even though it doesn't actually use the term taxable income, but it is, again, the vote of the people was contemporaneous with the rest of these changes and the enactment of the Personal Income Tax Act of 1969 in the previous year.
Right, and colleagues, Mr. Chair, I just point out, neither disagree, but just to keep in mind, it was interesting, because Senator Byer and I both, took the time to look at the AAA case in regards to the transportation package and the excise tax, and of course, the Oregon Supreme Court was almost solely focused on what did the voter think they were doing way back when it was put on the ballot. What did the ballot pamphlet say? What were the statements made in the pamphlet, so on and so forth, and it was not what we would think. It's, they were going back to literally the election day when that clause in Article 9 that we had in the transportation package, when that was. And it's not like what we thought, what we understood, or what we've been doing. They went back and were interested to know what did the common Oregonian think he was doing when he voted yes or no on that thing way back when. And in this case, it would be 1970.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
And so we'll segue back to Chris for any policy discussion as to whether this makes sense in spite of the fact that it would be a fairly complex bill.
So, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, there's and for the public, there's a document in OLS titled FTI versus AGI. And it sets aside kind of the legal questions that you just discussed and heard, and takes a step back and looks at the tax policy implications, some pros and cons. So in some respects, it assumes that you could pick your starting point. But what we have here is, I try to simplify the federal tax form, or represent it in kind of an equation form there, and to identify some of these key terms and where they show up, and along with their magnitudes. So the dollar amounts are tax year 2015, they're from IRS data. But starting at that top left, we have all of the components of income, wages, interest, dividends, and so forth. And those all feed into what is called total income. And total income is a key term. It shows up on the federal tax form. And in 2015, for Oregonians, that amount was $120 billion. And then there are what are called either adjustments or above-the-line deductions. These are deductions that are separate from the standard and itemized deductions. Everybody gets these. These include things like student loan interest, self-employed health insurance, those kinds of things. Those amount to about $2 billion. And then the result of that is AGI, which is a common phrase that everybody's familiar with. And the adjusted gross income in 2015 for Oregonians was $118 billion. And this again, the federal form. Subtracted from that are the standard or itemized deductions, the Schedule A, and then personal exemptions. Keeping in mind the federal code has a personal exemption deduction. Oregon does not. We have a personal exemption credit. And so resulting from that, we get to the taxable income, federal taxable income, and that's $81 billion. So from an economic standpoint, the tax base we're talking about is $81 billion for taxable income, or $118 billion for AGI. And you've heard economists talk over and over again with respect to taxes, broad-based, low rate, that kind of discussion. So what this presents here are some different opportunities for the legislature, because what we're talking about is a balancing act between the simplicity of just tying to federal law and just copying everything there, so that the ease for the administration by the Department of Revenue, as well as ease of compliance, versus flexibility for policymakers. And so I just had three other points here. The starting point here, the federal taxable income. Some of the pros here are the easier administration and compliance, and then you have the rolling reconnect. You just heard that it's not required, and there are pros and cons to that, but you can have that as a rolling reconnect. And some of the cons are the state revenue is subject to the federal tax changes, and I won't belabor that point. The state is at the whims of the federal changes. If we go to federal AGI, we have that broader base and that policy flexibility. You don't necessarily have to have a revenue change here, but it gives you broader policy flexibility with respect to any changes that you want to make, since you're starting with a larger tax base. And some of the cons are you're still tied to federal provisions that intersect in different places here. And the example here that it even came up in this morning's discussion is depreciation. That actually feeds into the net business income that shows up on the tax return. So that shows up in that upper left box, the net business income. And there are many, many places where the Oregon tax law is connected to federal tax law. It's not just one of these 2 points. Mm-hmm. Another example is the earned income tax credit. We have our earned income tax credit, but it is just a percentage of the federal tax credit. So there are a lot of places. What we're really talking about here is just that starting point. And then you can even have other starting points. For example, some states only tax interest and dividends. But then you're getting into a major cultural change as to what the taxation system is. And states that do that usually have a sales tax or some other dominant revenue source. So the second point there, the policy opportunities that I was alluding to by going to AGI, and these are some examples that have come up over the years that have been explored. The HMI stands for the home mortgage interest deduction, so the feds have a home mortgage interest deduction. There have been some stakeholders who are interested in disconnecting from that and instead having a state tax credit, a home mortgage tax credit, that provides different opportunities with respect to the impact on the income distribution and different income levels, and having our own state policy, and it can be crafted a lot of different ways with almost any variant that a policymaker can think of. The second one is the medical deduction, and this is one where we have, for the longest time, we had our own medical itemized deduction. It's now a subtraction. It provides different flexibility for the state, and even that could go away and have a tax credit. It's really getting back at any ideas that stakeholders may have for changing the way we're implementing. Basically, what I'm talking about are the Schedule A deductions. So rather than just piggybacking on them directly, the state could add its own flavor to how it wants to implement those policies. And then item C there, I've labeled subsidized local government taxes, and this is really the property tax deduction. So while the property taxes are deductible on the state income tax, voters, when they're considering voting for an increase in a local option levy or something like that, they may know that they'll pay that amount of property tax, but some of that will come back to them through the deductibility on the state income tax, as well as the federal. Now that's changed a little bit with the Tax Cut and Jobs Act because of the SALT limitation of $10,000. So that there's a mix there at the federal level. At the Oregon level, we've never allowed a state income tax deduction against the state income tax. So it's really just the property. That SALT deduction for Oregon purposes is really just the property tax deduction. And then the last item here is the impact of the change, and I just listed all three possibilities. It could be a revenue neutral change, or a revenue increase or decrease. You can get to a revenue increase by not changing the tax rates. For example, you just take the existing tax rate structure and apply it to AGI, and that would result in a revenue increase. You could go for a decrease in revenue where you change the rate structure. And then the revenue neutrality could be a mix of policies. For the driver behind a revenue neutral might be to change the incidence across income groups to make the system a little more progressive, for example, or something along those lines. Those would be some options. And by disconnecting from basically the Schedule A deductions and going for some of these other credits, you can affect the distribution of the tax a little bit differently. And so the policy, I didn't really put any revenue impact numbers here because the opportunities are pretty vast.
Moving lots of parts.
A lot of moving parts, but just, so this is intended to be just a conceptual discussion.
Sure, yeah.
About the things that could happen, you know, assuming that all of the legal questions are settled, if you wanted to move this direction, that there could be a lot of tools at your disposal and for a lot of very deliberate discussions.
Yeah, it's interesting, only to us, interesting policy discussion. Senator Burchett.
Yeah, thank you. Scroll up a little bit if you could to your flow chart there. So if the way I'm looking at it is we're actually we could disconnect totally from the federal at the adjusted gross income level. We could, and so then 179, section 179 of the federal code would fall under itemized deductions. So we'd have the ability to put caps on that if we wanted to.
Yes, Senator, and that is something that has come up a lot over the past 10 years as the federal government has changed their depreciation schedules, the bonus depreciation, the section 179. We could disconnect from that selectively. So now what you're talking about is a selective disconnect. And we could disconnect from those and have our own state schedules, and that gives the state the opportunity to put in whatever caps or have it directed and not subject to the whims of federal changes. And that, so this discussion was started with a kind of a broad, where do we connect, taxable income, AGI. But as the committee is aware, you can selectively disconnect from any of the provisions. It's just kind of a one-by-one versus a...
Painfully aware.
Yes.
Painfully aware.
Senator Boquist.
Senator, could you scroll back up so we could just see the bottom line here? Or was there? Subsidized local government taxes. I want to go back to that just briefly in the future, because I mean, Senator Riley and I and two House members spend an enormous amount of our time up until at least the last 6 months trying to understand what we don't know in the nonprofit realm. And the reason that discussion came up and I'm gonna come back to that, is, property tax base. And of course, all we were trying to do, which our House colleagues again did not agree with, was say, okay, let's create our own sort of database and access so that we know what we don't know. What is the income out there in a consolidated place in terms of what's there? I raised that point for this one, and I almost raised it with the state economist to ask him, and I think I will send him an email. And that is that there's absolutely no doubt that there has been economic enhancement across the United States because of the Affordable Care Act. No doubt whatsoever. I mean, if you look in my district, in Senator Burt Sugar's district, and some of the other Republican districts, which we track, sorry folks, we don't track yours, but that's okay. You have seen access, or those on the Affordable Care Act, or either getting direct medical care or subsidized medical care anywhere, raising from the 31 or 32% range in our districts all the way up to 42% in some of our districts. And considering all of our healthcare bills, we all know that's a big chunk of change. I then leave here and go to the state of Texas as an example of what we don't know even in this arena that I think is very important, because we hear city and counties tell us they don't have enough property taxes, so on and so forth. My daughter lives in a county in Texas, and in that county in Texas has an interesting medical system which experienced the same financial enhancement going the direction, and that is that the county operates all of the hospitals, period, as a public entity, and it's paid for in property taxes. And the healthcare, other than a very minute section that's almost intractable, is in the private sector, which of course is paying property taxes to go into the county coffers, to go into the healthcare. We in our state are on the exact end. I think we have one private health carrier in the delivery system, and one community type down, I think, in Coos Bay that's a district. And the rest of that is all going into the nonprofit sector. What was brought to Senator Riley and our work group as one of the premises going forward for our discussion, bringing it back here to Oregon, is that, and I've experienced this myself, dentist, doctor, all that stuff. They were in private sector, and of course they came to the conclusion very rapidly that they sold out their practices to the nonprofits. Their buildings became nonprofits and went off the tax rolls, and I still have the same doctor, and I still have the same dentist, and I still have the same daughter has the same specialist, but these are all nonprofit entities who all came off the tax rolls. I think it would be interesting on that line right there is there's got to be somebody in the think tank, and I don't even care if it's Heritage or Pew at either end of the spectrum, that somebody, or the Tax Foundation, has somebody looked at this and said, okay, we're seeing this huge economic impact at the property base level at the cities and the counties. And the importance of this is that nearly 75% of our human services that we have out there is delivered from the state through the counties and the 3 or 4 metropolitan areas. And so we're paying the cities and counties to go out and do our stuff, and of course they are either subsidizing or losing money in this thing. And at the same time, I see the good lobbyist out there, the educational district is losing all this property tax going off into this deal. And I will just point out to you, which I did not point out in the previous section, is the federal tax law that was just passed did do 2 things that are intriguing that we haven't mentioned. One, the state economist pointed to, is did increase wage income coming in, and so we were actually seeing a tax benefit because in the wage category for there. But the other interesting thing that's buried in that is an excise tax on nonprofits. Let me say that again. Buried in the federal tax plan from December is an excise tax on certain activities of nonprofits. So I only raise that if we're going to have a broader discussion, that we should really try and figure out, I mean, we're losing at the property tax level these dollars. And if we're going to do, and it's large dollars, and we're of course then trying to figure out how to subsidize that loss, at the same time deal with the growing PERS situation, which I know someone's going to find a solution in the next session, of course, and those other issues like that. And so I would say that piece we should throw into the toolbox as we discuss this.
I absolutely agree with Senator Boquist. I mean, I look at my county, and the biggest, or if not the biggest, employers in my county are nonprofits now.
Well, we won't do a work group. That'd be cruel. This is
We've done that already.
We have done that, and you see we both have gray hair, more than you do, Mr. Chair.
But it's something to keep an eye on. 1528 wasn't, I think, a pleasant process for anybody in this legislature. We're one of only 7 states that do it this way. And anyway, it got my attention, and I think it's something we can sort of keep on the back burner as something to explore or not. But thank you for your presentation. And
Thank
to
you.
Legislative Council, Kate. That takes us to the end for our agenda, Senator Berger.
See you later. I'm gonna make my journey back.
Make your journey. We're all going to make our journeys.
Some of us
I'm
have.
glad you
Well,
are.
some of us have
I have 3 more
afternoon
freaking commitments.
responsibilities.
I'm sure you'll do the right thing.
All right, thank you, everyone. We are adjourned.